Okay, so I'm trying to get off Twitter as of late, but it's kind of hard because it's pretty addicting. But for every fun trend, there's something else I see that makes me want to claw my eyes out. And I have one specific example in mind. So I follow this one person on Twitter, and she's a young activist who uses her platform to advocate for larger global environmental issues. She basically represents everything the future generation should become. But of course, this is Twitter and no one can be happy, so she has haters. A legion of grown men who essentially take cheap shots at her whenever they can. And usually this doesn't really bother me. However, there's one specific example that kind of bothered me. So I don't remember the exact tweet. However, she was at this conference and she was just showing off what she was doing, but she was holding a transparent water bottle. And there was no cover on it, you couldn't tell what it was. But immediately a bunch of people got into her comments saying that she's a hypocrite for using plastic water bottles, even though you couldn't actually tell what it was. In fact, it seems more like a glass bottle to me, but whatever. But you see, that's the main issue. These people who were in her comments don't actually care about the environment at all. They don't care if the water bottle was actually hers. They don't care where she got it from. They just wanted to get her in a weird gotcha moment to prove something. I'm not even sure what. It's something you see very often. I do work with waste management, and you'd be surprised how many people would love to get you in a weird gotcha moment. It seems as if their own mistakes don't matter as much. Usually, you'll see someone trying to speak on the actual issue itself, such as climate change, but then you have someone else who will arrive who will use bad logic or bad science to disprove what they're saying, and then just move on with their day. In fact, it seems more like a coping mechanism to me. It seems that many people would rather dismiss someone else's logic and then not think about the more larger issue at hand. Okay, I won't say that. I do think there are some people who have genuinely good intentions when they do this. However, I think they're kind of missing the whole point of the discussion itself. And more broadly, they're missing the problem with their line of thinking. When we speak about climate change, climate action, or climate responsibility, it's usually from an individual level, like what you specifically can do about it. But I think that's kind of a wrong approach to take of it. I'll explain that more later on, but first I'd like to explain why people think this way in the first place and why I think it's inherently problematic. So first, there are usually two main methods. There's the good reason and then the bad reason as to why people attack others on an individual level about their climate action. Okay, so let's begin with the good reason as to why someone should take individual responsibility for climate action. And that usually takes the form of carbon footprint. So I have very complex thoughts on carbon footprint. I think I best describe it as a love-hate relationship. So here's the thing. I think carbon footprint is actually a good thing because it allows people to monitor and actually evaluate how they conduct their lives. However, I do think that on a larger scale, it's kind of negative. On one hand, it's a great idea since it allows people to think more critically of their own actions when it comes to what they eat and what they compost or anything else. However, I do think that there are some net negatives when it comes to it. I do think that the overall mindset for carbon footprint tends to make people believe that their individual action is the utmost priority, and their failure to actually reduce their carbon footprint is a failure against the planet itself, which again is true. You should be more conscious of what you use. However, I do think that this overall destroys the greater argument that should be going on. So let me give you a bit of a background. The large majority of the carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere is created by large big oil companies, right? Not by individuals. Massive companies who are literally destroying the planet itself. And they know that's the case. It's well known now that most big oil companies knew very much in the past that their actions were essentially destroying the planet itself. But they didn't really care because they were still making a lot of money. So what they did is that they would at first hide the truth, try their best to essentially discredit any actual findings that would hurt their profits. but then eventually it became too large to actually ignore. So they would essentially find ways to be more sustainable in their actions. And one practice they've done is carbon footprint. They don't try to actually stop what they're doing, they just try to make it more sustainable, whatever that means. And then eventually carbon footprinting has been pushed to individual people. Now again, on the surface, there's nothing wrong with carbon footprinting. I think it's a very good practice for everyone to actually do. It's not only a great way to critique what you do as an individual, but also a great way to critique how your actions affect the world around you. But again, here I think lies the bigger problem. The climate crisis is not something that the individual can actually solve. And again, massive corporations are the ones that are doing most of the damage. So even if most people would live a more sustainable life, that wouldn't change the fact that we need to actually think critically of these big companies and help stop their practices. And on some level, it feels a bit nefarious. It feels like it's a distraction to forget the fact that it's not really the individual's fault. Because carbon footprinting makes you feel like it's your fault, right? Some people will criticize others for how they conduct their own business. And at some points, they're critical of how they do it themselves. But they seem to forget that on a larger scale, the climate crisis is not really their fault. It's massive corporations' faults. And in turn, it stops people from having the more important discussion on the global scale, right? It keeps the discussion and the movement individual and small instead of being what it should be, massive and global. And here we have the second reason, the bad reason, as to why someone else would criticize someone's climate action or responsibility. And this ties back to what I was speaking before in the intro. Okay, so I think the best way to explain this would be to speak about something else that I heard about. So a few years back, there was this rise in feminist movement in South Korea. And essentially, they were fighting for more equal rights. But again, like any social issue, it takes time to achieve their goal, mainly because the Great Society and specifically higher up government, which is mostly male-dominated, didn't seem to give them the time of day. So eventually, the movement decided to take a different approach. They would take an emoji, this one, and use it as their symbol, which obviously indicates that a man has a small manhood. And that's when people got really mad. And then eventually the discussion became as to why they need to even do this in the first place, which of course I've explained why that is. Like any social movement, there wasn't any actual discussion happening because most people in the status quo didn't want to hear it. In the blink of an eye, the discussion changed from women's rights, women's equality, to why you should make fun of a man's manhood. Did that example make sense? I'm not sure if it made sense, but it made sense to me in my mind. The greater point I'm trying to make here is to show how easily a conversation can be derailed from something important, like women's rights, to something that in the grand scheme of things isn't that important, like someone's manhood. I'm gonna keep calling it that because I don't want this video to get affected in any way. When it comes to environmentalism and climate action, you will find everywhere people who are trying to essentially derail the conversation to something that's not that important, whether it be if climate change is actually real or how much it actually impacts people. Just like the Twitter example from before, those people were not trying to actually criticize her actions. They don't actually care. They were just saying that to essentially, like I said, get her in a gotcha moment and derail the conversation from something important like climate conference to something pretty trivial and petty in the grand scheme of things. And again, the point is not just to derail, it's to stop the conversation entirely. There are so many people who don't believe that the climate crisis is happening, and therefore they'll try their best to essentially stop any discourse from happening itself. And the best way to do so is to, like I said, derail the conversation to something else. These are, in truth, bad faith actors who are just trying to hurt the movement as much as possible. Unlike the previous reason, which have actual people who want to have a real conversation and help in some way, this one does not. So it's not really worth discussing or interacting with these people in the most part. You can just kind of ignore them and they'll eventually go away. There's no point in trying to debate someone on whether climate change is real or whether someone is a right candidate to discuss on climate issues. They've already made up their mind. They're just trying to convince you of their opinion, which there's no point in actually discussing that. In other words, these people essentially weaponize individual action to disrupt the movement as much as possible. Because, like I said before, due to concepts such as carbon footprint, the movement has stayed on a more individual and local level, I feel like. And then these people come in and try to disrupt that local level as much as possible, which usually is to stop any conversation from ever happening. Okay, so now that we've seen good and bad individual action, I should probably speak on how I think a healthy conversation should go when it comes to these topics. So it's pretty simple. I do think individual action should be more of a collective one. Again, the climate crisis won't be solved by you yourself. It has to be a more community-based thing. So when it comes to carbon footprint, don't just think about what you do, think about what everyone else you know also does. But again, don't just criticize them. Have actual constructive criticism and have an actual conversation when it comes to these topics. In other words, the main thing when it comes to individual action is to foster a community of people who all want to speak about individual action, which I know sounds contradictory, but I think it is the best way to do so. Individual action can only get you so far. It's only by having an actual community of people who are willing to do it with you that you can actually bolster a more productive and healthy life. More importantly, when you're a community, you can keep other large corporations in check more easily than when you were simply by yourself. So yes, I do think you should look into carbon footprint. However, when doing so, remember two main things. Number one is when you're trying to live a more sustainable life, having a support group of people with you who are trying to do the same will make the process far more effective. And of course, when you do so, you'll eventually foster a large community of people who will be willing to take that activism to a whole new level with you. And from there, you can actually do some real global change. And number two, remember that the climate crisis is not really, again, your fault. But again, you will suffer the consequences, which I know might make it tempting to point fingers and tear others down. However, in the end, the best thing to do is to help each other out. And if you do want to point fingers, remember who are the ones who are causing the main issues we see today. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, probably in a week or not, I don't know. Like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.